I started realizing, well, there's a lot of cults that are popping up, right? Like Hollywood has a lot of cults, a lot of
A-listers who are immersed in Hollywood
are spies,
are verified spies for America. When you say verified, how verified are we talking?
No, he actually wasn't.
Like we can go to CIA's website and it's
yes.
declassified.
Ruslan.
So you got 2 books that are out: Esoteric Hollywood Part 2, and then the third one's coming out this July.
Yeah, and a philosophy book. So I got
philosophy books, and you go from writing about this stuff as an undergrad into on your master's to really picking apart the symbolism. But from your perspective, it sounds like, if I'm tracking correctly, the symbols weren't just used as propaganda for the Cold War. They sound like they become more darker in some of these films, where we're now dealing with full-on occult stuff.
Right.
Was there a specific shift that happened in Hollywood where it went from like, we're going to use James Bond, superhero, America's great, to like, no, we're going to start diving in some of this more occult imagery?
Yes, I would say after the 60s counterculture revolution, you have some avant-garde filmmakers who were self-professed Satanists, like Kenneth Anger. They were very into Crowley. He's a famous Skittles avant-garde like icon of.
By the way, I just want to say I love Skittles. We're taking that. We usually say LG TV because all of our TVs are LG TV. Skittles is brilliant. Keep going. I'm sorry.
And Anger was like in the circles of the Rolling Stones and hanging out with like people from the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey, that kind of stuff, which I know that's not theistic Satanism. It's just kind of atheism with
it's like they're like trolling
costumes. Yeah.
But
there are sides and groups that do take us seriously.
Yeah.
And
or they start kind of trolling and then all of a sudden, we had Shane Smith on, and that was his journey. He was like, oh, just kind of playing around and being silly. And then it's like, now we're full on dabbling with witchcraft and dark forces. Yeah.
And I kind of inadvertently found that interesting through the grad work, like studying Hollywood and symbolism. And then I started realizing, well, there's a lot of cults that are popping up, right? Like Hollywood has a lot of cults, a lot of directors, a lot of A-listers. They're tied into cults. And many of them are working for intelligence. Like they work for the CIA, they work for the FBI. Some of the most famous A-listers have been OSS operatives, FBI informants, and CIA operatives. So
in Hollywood.
Yeah. Some of the most famous A-listers on record. It's declassified. So the third book has a whole chapter on people like Sterling Hayden. It was declassified. That
A-listers who are immersed in Hollywood
are spies.
Are verified spies. For America, for our side, or for okay, I was going to say that would be really crazy.
Right. Well, the belief was that a couple of them were
double
spies.
agents.
Yeah. So like, for a long time, Marlene Dietrich was suspected of being a spy for Tiny Mustache Man.
And so, how famous are these folks? Are these like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson
these are
famous?
Like, these are A-listers of that time, right? So
and they're verified spies.
Well, she was suspected of being a Tiny Mustache Man spy.
Okay.
And so the FBI and the U.S. intelligence like investigated her and had files on her, but it turns out she was actually trying to spy for the OSS, which is the CIA's predecessor in America.
Interesting.
Yeah, Sterling Hayden was a verified OSS agent operative.
When you say verified, how verified are we talking?
No, he actually wasn't.
Like we can go to CIA's website and it's
yes,
declassified.
Declassified. Yeah, National Archives. Yeah, declassified.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cary Grant was an informant. He spied on because they thought Errol Flynn was a Tiny Mustache Man spy. So they asked Cary Grant to like inform on people.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now when you say spies, is it kind of like, hey, you're famous, so you get a knock on a door from the CIA, and when you go over to do this press tour, we want you to keep an eye on stuff? Or are they like CIA operatives who were trained?
Both.
Both.
It can be both. I think in Cary Grant's case, he was just asked to spy and inform. Jimmy Stewart, right? The most famous like A-lister of his time. He actually was like, he worked for the FBI. He made FBI propaganda movies. You can go watch his FBI movies. In fact, Laurel Canyon, which is a famous movie studio, if you drive up Wonderland Avenue on Mulholland Drive, you get to the top and there's a giant Air Force studio that was like the preeminent studio of its time. I think I have it covered in the first chapter of the first book. All of the A-listers had Department of Defense badges that gave them access to this secret studio that the Air Force owned. So there's a clear connection right there. In fact, Marilyn Monroe had a badge, like a DOD badge. So a lot of these people are actually recruited to also do varying levels of spy work.
And so in that, it sounds like as there is the rise of the hippie revolution, the sex revolution, all this sort of stuff, it goes from, hey, we're just kind of fighting this Cold War, keeping an eye on our enemies, pushing American propaganda, to now there's this countercultural
and darker stuff.
And darker stuff is rising up. Would you say that was calculated and intentional, or would you say that all of a sudden the people who are the artists and the creatives are going down this in their own worldview,
right,
and so it starts seeping into the media?
A degree of both. You can look at things like the S.D.N.Y Institute, which was pushing kind of the think tank behind the whole counterculture New Age movement of the 60s. And S.D.N.Y was promoted by very powerful, wealthy people. You can look it up, and they've had all the most famous kind of New Agey people go and speak there over the years. Deepak Chopra, Aldous Huxley, they've all promoted all that stuff from S.D.N.Y, which is, up Big Sur. If you just drive up Big Sur, there's a S.D.N.Y up there.
Yeah.
But
Deepak Chopra had like an office out here in
really?
Encinitas, I think. Yeah, he has a pretty big footprint here locally. Yeah.
So all that stuff was supported from the top down, but a lot of the people in that counterculture, maybe not the mainstream, but many of them were into that avant-garde, like satanic type stuff. Not so much LaVey, but more so Crowley, who was pretty serious about his Satanism. And he was a British spy too, by the way.
Wow.
He worked for MI5. And Crowley is kind of the forefather, not just of yoga in the West with Madame Blavatsky, but the sexual revolution. So the 60s counterculture stuff owes its ethos actually to Aleister Crowley, and many of the people in the 60s counterculture, like Dr. Tim Leary, who worked for the CIA on record, he called himself the new Aleister Crowley because his idea was we can really revolutionize the culture, not just through drugs, but also through sex. So sex and drugs. And so Hollywood played a key role in that in the 60s, and a lot of the counterculture people coming out of the Laurel Canyon scene were also directly connected to intelligence.
What was the motive behind it? Like, why do you think they wanted to create this countercultural or kind of hedonistic, weird, new agey thing driven by sex and all this stuff, drugs and mysticism?
So some of the people who were Fabian socialist technocrats had already talked about this strategy and this plan in the 1920s and 30s. So Bertrand Russell talked about it. He was a very open, he lived in a pan polycule relationship before anyone else did. H.G. Wells was a famous, everybody knows him for like War of the Worlds, but he also wrote all these mainline geopolitical books like Open Conspiracy, New World Order. That's from him. It's his book. And in those books, he describes how they would revolutionize Western civilization through counterculture, through sexual revolution, to make the West more amenable to a future socialist technocracy. So that's explicitly what's in those books.
So they're playing the long game.
Yeah.
They're thinking
that's the Fabian,
generations ahead.
Fabian model is the slow, it's their symbol's a turtle and a wolf in sheep's clothing. So that's a slow burn model. Boiling frog.
Isn't there some crossover with some of this and the postmodernist and the folks who are into critical theory?
Yes.
The French philosophers that were also into the PDF stuff, the PDF file stuff. And they were trying to normalize this. And for whatever reason, that didn't get normalized, but some of this other weird stuff got normalized.
You got to do it in phases, right? So if you want to get to that like extreme level, you take it in that slow burn model. Like you have one revolution, next revolution, right? Feminism worked the same way. And you couldn't have the Skittles had you not already had the feminist revolution, right? In my second book, the first chapter actually addresses what you're talking about. I talk about the deconstructionists. Do you know the CIA went and like made alliances with the French postmodernist deconstructionists?
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
For the culture war. It's called the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
It's in chapter 1. You said the aviator chapter?
No, I think it's the chapter before
introduction.
That. Yeah, I think it's in the introduction.
Okay.
You see...
The cool thing, just real quick, about this is you have citations for all this. So you're not just like winging it.
No, there's like 360 footnotes, I think.
Yeah, there's a ton of footnotes.
In the first one. I forget how many is in the second one, but yeah, that's from the academic background. It's like you got to source everything.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I mean, when I was working on my own book, it was the same thing. It was like I would have quotes in there, and they would dig up the actual quote, not the one I thought, not the person I thought who said it. So okay, so they're rolling it out in phases. They can't just jump all the way into kids Skittles. They have to be a bit more careful. Right. And then over time, but why do you think the kids Skittles thing's never caught on? Like, or is it catching on with some of this Transformer stuff today?
It is, yeah, exactly.
It is catching on now.
So, but they had to do it like in the phases.
Okay.
Right.
So today, like the would you connect it to now kids don't have to give consent or who are incapable of giving consent for anything else, but are able to make life-changing things happen to their body with drugs and stuff that like is kind of coming out as bad. Would you say that that is now the let's try and alleviate consent from children because they can make would you connect those two? Does that make sense?
I would say it's the culmination
okay.
of what these revolutionaries wrote about. For example, Aldous Huxley wrote not just Brave New World, but he wrote Brave New World Revisited. And in the introduction, he talks about this book is not, strictly speaking, fiction. This is what the technocratic elite actually have planned for the future. And if you go back and read Brave New World, which we just did a book club on this a few months ago with my buddy, quite frankly, I read it 10 years ago. We reread it last year. And I never even noticed the second chapter is all about stuff. The World Socialist Controller mandates stuff for the dystopia.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
in
dark,
the second
man.
chapter. It gets really dark. I won't say what else goes on, but he actually calls himself Christ. He says, let the children come unto me in the context of people. Yeah, it's gross. But Huxley's telling you that the sexual revolution is what prepares the way for the Brave New World.
Do you think that there's been some slowdown with some of this stuff now that there seems to be a massive cultural pushback specifically against the transformer ideology?
Yeah, so all of that is spearheaded out of Tavistock. The Tavistock Institute in the UK is kind of the spearhead of, they were behind MK Ultra originally, and Huxley played a role in that because he was actually going to ORGY events with Crowley. They partied together, and Crowley wrote a book called Drug Diaries. And I did an interview with Dr. Richard Spence, who's a professor, kind of a historian of this stuff. He wrote a book on Crowley, and he's the one that demonstrated that Crowley was a British intelligence operative. And that's how he got linked up with Huxley, who was part of this inner clique of Fabian socialist elites, right? So when Huxley saw that Crowley had this drug diary, he was like, this might actually be an interesting study at a government level. So that became part of Tavistock. That eventually becomes MK Ultra in the US. It's the same program, but it's just different continents. And that led to the idea that you could engineer and change the human being, not just in his mind, but eventually it becomes a change of the entire physiognomy and the biology of a person. So I actually dug up in the first book, there's a chapter where I talk about papers that were written by people like Dr. Holger Hayden. He was a famous scientist who was invited to the 1969 mind control conference in San Francisco that Rockefellers put on. And it was sponsored by CIA's Voice of America. And his papers were about drugs and chemicals actually changing gender in men and women in the future. He's like, we can do this. 1969. Wow. Yeah, and I cite Dr. Holger Hayden's papers. You can still find them on Google Scholar if that still exists. But when I was writing the book, I was like looking up Google Scholar and finding all this stuff.
And so this stuff then starts kind of seeping into the media.
There's a white paper written in, I forget the exact date, maybe in the early 70s. It's called Changing Images of Man, and it's put out by Stanford Research Institute. And that's one of the key papers where they talked about re-engineering all of Western civilization's thoughts, not just about the environment, which is a lot of the green agenda stuff, but also man himself. And so they begin to talk about how we need to convince man that man is the problem.
Jeez.
And that's what leads to a lot of this sort of depopulation, anti-natalist type stuff.
Stuff is dark, man.
I'm just giving you the sources. These are all the sources. Could I recommend, if people do want to get Esoteric Hollywood 3, a lot of really cool movies. 1 and 2 obviously have a lot, but 3's got a lot of like Christopher Nolan. It's got all the Marvel movies.
It's pretty dope. When I didn't read the whole thing, but I definitely looked through it, and I was like, man, you hit a lot of the stuff I'm personally into.
You can go to jaysanalysis.com in the shop, and you can pre-order the part 3, and they're all signed. You can also get 1 and 2, but
jaysanalysis.com. We'll link that.
And there'll be a shop, and then you can get part 3, and it will come out in 2 months.
2 months, July.
Yes, mid-July.
Mid-July. So it'll be out, and they can check that out. And yeah, it looks dope. I mean, these are great. Part 1 and 2. But when I looked at that one, it just had more.
A lot of stuff you like.
It's just the stuff that I'm into. You know, you're going really deep in some of this stuff that like just kind of older movies. But on the third one, it was like, it's more newer stuff, right? Batman, like all the stuff that I would be
all
into.
the Marvel. Yep.
Why wait until this entire thing premieres on YouTube? Why not sign up for a free 7-day trial of our Patreon community and see this entire interview, as well as all of our interviews, early before they hit the public. And you'll also get access to the extended version of our conversations that are sometimes a little too spicy for YouTube. All right, so head on over to Patreon. Link is in the description or pinned comment. Here's a little preview of what's available on Patreon.
And it was sponsored by CIA's Voice of America. And his papers were about drugs and chemicals actually changing gender.
Why do you think there's this prediction happening? Why is there this fascination with the end days? And how is it different than the biblical account?
Yeah, I think Hollywood predicted its own demise by pushing an antichrist message and philosophy, which is mainstream media outlets, and like they started doing hit pieces saying that it was like this evil online cult and movement.
Some of the folks that I see that are coming towards Eastern Orthodoxy seem to have a crippling fear and anxiety around their own salvation.
The argument that you're making violates the very thing that you just said would relativize the positions.
The argument that I'm making right now.
Your argument is no different than anyone else's argument. You're citing, you're saying, I have this position, they have that position, you have your position.
Yeah.
Of course, but that has nothing to do with
Ruslan